The Christian message is clear. Ethnic prejudice is morally reprehensible. It's wrong. But the Roman world was filled with racism, and that shows up in the biblical text. All right, well, I've got to say, I am so proud that you all came today, because I thought for sure this is the chapter that's going to do us in. Chapter 2 is called The Bible in Color. My opening question for you is, what is one specific word, clothing item, or behavior that immediately signals that someone is a local in our city versus a tourist? So think about that. Share it with your neighbor. I think it's helpful if we start off defining the difference between race and ethnicity. They're not the same. And so we're, in week 1, we talked about some psychology. Week 2, we did some sociology. Now we're bringing in some anthropology. So we're going to study people here. So anthropology is the study of human societies and cultures. And so that brings us to ethnicity. So ethnicity is more about lineage. It's more about your family. Ethnicity is a social construct created by people who share common beliefs, values, customs, and language. Those are what unite people by ethnicity. It's not biological, but it's based on those factors. So, they may share characteristics, physical characteristics, but that's not the defining feature of ethnicity. Race, on the other hand, while it's also a social construct, it's more from the Enlightenment era. And it's more of a flattening, the trying to group people by skin color, by hair texture, by facial features. And unfortunately, the concept of race has been used for evil purposes, right? And it's used to create social hierarchies to justify discrimination, oppression, inequality. We've seen that repeated throughout history. So a way to think about this, ethnicity is the family story. Race is the checkbox, right? You're filling out government documents. You got to check which one you are. So ethnicity is much closer to what the Bible describes, right? We have multiple examples of associating people with their father, their grandfather, etc. It's all about the people group. And it includes shared language, the food your grandmother cooked, the stories your family tells, the land your ancestors walked on. That's ethnicity. Race is a relatively modern Western way of grouping people by governments, right, or societies to categorize people in large groups. So I hope that shows a clearer picture of the difference of what they're talking about in the chapter. I thought this table might help. It helped me. So in our culture, we often see white as a race, like on a checkbox, but our ethnicity might be Irish, German, British, Scot, right? Each of those has a different story, even a different way of celebrating Christmas. Okay? And the Bible cares deeply about family stories. So race is more like standing across the street and seeing a group of people who look similar. And ethnicity is walking into the backyard and knowing exactly how everyone's related, who brought the potato salad, and which branch of the family they belong to. Okay. So when the Bible talks about Hittite or Philistine, they're not talking about skin color, right? They're talking about family lineage. So the table has a column for race, a column for ethnicity, and so you can see that race is based on the physical features. Ethnicity is the shared history, the stories, the language, the land. Race is defined by society, typically governments, and ethnicity is defined by family or the community that you're in. In the Bible, we don't really hear about race at all, not like we do today, not like how we've defined it in our modern culture. Instead, we hear about tribes, tongues, languages, and nations. So an example would be a checkbox might be Asian, but ethnicity could be tribe of Benjamin or Galilean. Page 55, in the middle of the second paragraph, it talks about how sometimes we're slow to make distinctions because we don't want to offend anyone. Thus, it goes without being said for many that to be truly equal, everyone must be the same. This is what we mean by being colorblind, the belief that ethnic differences don't matter. But as we'll see, it really does in the Bible. In Revelation 7:9, for example, the vision of heaven isn't a colorblind crowd where we all look the same. It literally says every tribe and tongue and nation is present. You go back to the table of nations in Genesis 10. So Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, spread out over the known world. Ham's tribe and family went south on the continent of Africa. Shem's tribe stayed in the Levant, so the ancient Near East, what's now Israel, Jordan, and Syria, and that area. And Japheth's family went further east into Asia and then north into Europe. And so that makes a difference for how we read the stories because they each have their own cultures now. And we even see that at the day of Pentecost, when everyone comes from all of the lands that had been divided after the Tower of Babel. All of those people groups are brought back. They all have distinct languages, distinct traditions. That's ethnicity. And so it's important to God. It's everywhere in the Bible. And I love how this chapter really helps us see that. So the goal is, we're not trying to be politically correct on our terms, right? We're trying to be biblically accurate by seeing people the way the Bible sees them, as members of specific storied families. So the first example they give is Rebecca, and let me tell you, she does not like Esau's wives. Page 57. And toward the middle, it says in Genesis 27:46, for example, Rebecca exclaims her frustration with Esau's wives, not because he had more than one, that was kind of normal, but because of their ethnicity. I'm disgusted living because of these Hittite women, she says to Isaac. Okay, so what is it about the Hittite women? So I'm showing you a picture of the ancient gates that lead into a very famous Hittite city. The Hittites are always in the background of the Old Testament. They were in the Bronze Age. They lasted for about 450 years, and they controlled much of modern-day Turkey. So in the New Testament, it's called Asia Minor. And the Hittites controlled most of that. And it was from the shores of the Black Sea to the rivers of Mesopotamia, all the way to the Mediterranean. It was a very large culture, and they had a lot of land. They built sophisticated cities, impressive temples, and an elaborate palace in the rugged countryside of Anatolia. They actually went to battle against Egypt, and the battle was so fierce, it turned out to be a stalemate. And that led to the very first peace treaty in the entire world. So that's the Hittites. They were pretty fierce, but they're also called the people of 1,000 gods. They had quite the pantheon, just like, we hear of Baal for Canaanites. They had their own long list of gods. They had a storm god, fertility god, and so they obviously had some idol worship happening. And here is Rebecca, part of Abraham's family, trying to stay true to the covenant that Abraham made with God so they could be the promised family. And now Esau goes off and marries idolatrous wives. So you can see why she might be a little bit frustrated. Another part of the frustration is the Hittites were considered part of the cursed Canaanite lineage. So remember how Noah's son Ham went in the tent? He was cursed. Well, his son Canaan had a son named Heth, and that he's the founder of the Hittites. So it's that cursed lineage that also probably ticked off Rebecca. She's like, of all families, you had to go with that one. Like, come on. But I know you've heard of other Hittites in the Bible. Can you remember any? Quiz time. I'll give you a hint. Bathsheba. Uriah the Hittite. Yes. Yeah, one of David's mighty men. Yes. Abraham bought the family burial ground from Ephron the Hittite. King Solomon had Hittites among his wives. We know how that went. So you can see now why Rebecca was a little miffed. Not only did he marry women from a cursed lineage, the black sheep of the family, the wrong side of the family, but they were also worshiping other gods, not the one true God. So that's the Hittites. We're learning more and more about them. For a long time, they had disappeared off the map, and nobody could confirm that they were there. They hadn't found anything. It was almost mythical. And so recently, they have had a lot of archaeological digs up in Turkey and have uncovered this vast complex and temples and, like it said, the palace. So pretty cool. We know more about them. But their idolatry was taking Esau away from worshiping the one true God. Okay. So that was page 57. On page 58, the bottom of 57 and the top of 58. So it's talking about Paul, and I have a lovely painting of Paul here. This is on a wall in Ephesus, and we missed it. We did not get to see that, and we have to go back. More on Paul. How about that time that he was mistaken for an Egyptian? And not just any Egyptian, the one that claimed to be a Messiah. So that's on the bottom of 58. That was in Acts 21. So Paul had just gotten done taking his Nazirite vow, where he had his head shaved. And I had never thought about this, but he was mistaken for that Egyptian because Egyptians had shaved heads. When we were in Turkey, our Turkish guide, Melik, said that, Paul would have looked like a Turkish man because that was the area he was from ethnically. And so our guide was convinced he would look like a modern day Turkish man, with darker skin, darker hair. That cracked me up when he said that. But you think about it, and maybe it's easy to see why he was mistaken for an Egyptian, right? It fits the color profile. He's got the shaved head. And the Roman centurion, the Roman who arrested Paul, was surprised he could speak Greek. Dum, dum, dum. Yeah, so he never imagined Paul, a barbarian, might be a fellow Roman citizen. Yeah. This made me think of something that I learned, and it's called the cross-race effect. This has actually been studied since, I think, 1914. And the study I was reading was from 2001. It's a fascinating brain shortcut that your brain does, and it's a well-documented phenomenon that happens, and it shows that people are significantly more accurate identifying faces of people of their own race. The cross-race effect is the tendency for people to more easily recognize and distinguish faces of their own racial group than other groups. And I've noticed this too. I have mistaken some of my African students at school, and I'll get their names mixed up because they look so similar to me. But then they're in the same class, and they laughed because they're like, we don't look anything alike. Are you kidding? And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. But it's actually been studied why we do that. And I think maybe that's what happened to this Roman who arrested Paul. He knows how his own people look, but everybody else looks the same. It happens. So it isn't about disliking another group. It's just perceptual expertise, as the study said. Again, our brains are like computers, right? So if they spend 50 years looking at white Caucasian faces, that's what you know the most about. You become experts at noticing eye color, hair texture, nose shape. And then when that same brain looks at a different group, it hasn't yet learned the features. That's why we mix people up. So I thought that was a fascinating little insight into why Paul was misidentified. Okay, on page 59, this section is called A Slave Race. This was fascinating. I'll tell you about this image in a minute. But the first paragraph talks about, there's more to ethnicity than skin color. And so sometimes we find it difficult to detect the ethnic dimensions of a situation in the Bible, even when the author's trying to make it plain. So Luke, for example, sprinkles ethno-linguistic markers, so the language people speak, through the account of Paul's time in Jerusalem in Acts 21. So we've got the mention of Gentiles in verse 11, Cyprus in verse 21, that's a separate island, Trophimus the Ephesian in verse 29. Do you speak Greek in verse 37? Aren't you the Egyptian in verse 38? I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, verse 39. That's a totally different area in Turkey. In Aramaic, verse 40, and then 22, verse 1, like over and over. I have always glossed over those until I started learning more about geography. And it's fascinating. And so all of that crescendos to Paul's surprising news. He was born a Roman citizen in Acts 22. So paying attention to the geographic locations in verses or the language mentioned will give us these clues that maybe it's more about ethnicity. But let's talk about Moses' wife. So I have a picture up on the screen. I don't know, has anyone seen the new series called The Promised Land? Okay, maybe not. It's pretty new. It's on YouTube. It's branched off the studio that made The Chosen. This is a comedy in the style of The Office. So you know exactly what it is, yes. And it is hilarious. Some might think it's irreverent, so I'll put that out there. But it's about, from their perspectives, crossing the Red Sea, coming across the Red Sea, going through the wilderness. And what the authors point out, I'm using her picture. This is Zipporah. It's interesting because there is debate among scholars whether Moses had one wife or two. So Zipporah obviously is named, so I put her picture here. She's a Midianite. Midianites were nomads, and so some scholars think, well, she could have been a Cushite too. That area is in southern Egypt, northern Sudan. And so for us, that tells us that they are black-skinned people. And the problem that Miriam and Aaron had was not the color of her skin, right? So we tend to assume that, from our experience in our country, we have a history with slavery. So that's kind of where our mind goes is, they're upset because he married someone who was part of a group that was enslaved. But if we take it in context, the Hebrew people just came out of Egypt. They were the ones that were enslaved. And they're upset because the Cushites were respected as highly skilled soldiers. Yeah. So they were upset that he married up. And the scholars who think that Moses had a second wife, they think that it's actually a Cushite princess. And so if that's the case, he really married up. It's just interesting that for years, Western scholars, including H.P. Smith, they talk about in the middle of page 60, in his commentary literally says, Joab then calls a Negro naturally a slave and commands him, right? The text in 2 Samuel never actually says a slave or hints that the person was a slave, mainly that they were a Cushite. So it's easy to make mistakes when we don't understand the history or the ethnicity or the geography of where they're from, right? So Miriam and Aaron were upset that Moses married up. Let's see. Page 63. Let's move on to twang. The next section. So several of you mentioned earlier that you can tell who's not a local by their accent. They could tell that too. So they give a few personal examples, and then in the middle of page 63, they talk about Judges 12. And in Judges 12, Jephthah rallies the men of Gilead to battle the Ephraimites. right? Two tribes from the sons of Jacob. Ethnically, the Gileadites and the Ephraimites were related. Both tribes spoke Semitic languages, and they shared Joseph as a common ancestor. But after the battle, the Gileadites developed a clever way to identify which survivors were friends and which were enemies. This just seems so mean. So they guarded the fords of the Jordan, and when a survivor tried to pass through, they're like, okay, say this word. And the problem was Ephraimites couldn't do their digraph SH. That just really seems mean. They couldn't say the word correctly because they couldn't pronounce SH. So if they said Shibboleth instead of Shibboleth. Oh, that's a fantastic question. I looked it up actually. Hey, have your blue letter Bibles ready? Grab your blue letter Bible. Let's go to Judges 12. This is a good example. So Judges 12, and the easiest verse is, let's see, verse 6, Judges 12:6. So find that first in your Blue Letter Bible app. And then when you're there, click on the word Shibboleth in verse 6. And then it should pop up a menu that says study, has a category of study, and then click interlinear. Is everyone there? Okay. When you click on the word, it pops up a menu. It looks like, can you see that? Looks like that. Click on interlinear at the top. Oh, let's find out. What do you got? Are you looking in the app? Oh, so no, don't highlight it. Just click on the word. There you go. And then click interlinear. Isn't this cool? And then scroll down. Oops, I got out of it. Okay, I'm going to turn my volume up.
Strong's H 7641, Shibboleth, and second entry, Shibboleth.
Okay, you got that? Okay, but if you're an Ephraimite, you can't say SH, so this is how it sounds. Whoops. Oh, no, don't go that way. I hit the wrong button. Oh, here we go.
Strong's H 5451, Shibboleth. Shibboleth.
Okay, and it actually means, let's look it up. You can click on that word and it pops up with the etymology of the word. Flowing stream is the first definition. When you're in the interlinear, you got to scroll down. You know what? Maybe I should show you on the laptop actually. No, it's okay. It takes a little practice. Okay, I'm going to pick NIV. And it is Judges 12:6. Here, let me do that. Okay, so here's up on, not on the screen, just kidding. Wait for it. Aha, okay. So Judges 12:6, there's the Shibboleth and Shibboleth. So if you click on here, you have to click on tools, and then there's interlinear. When you scroll down, it goes word by word. And this is where I clicked on the audio to hear it. And Shibboleth, if you click on the Strong's, H is Hebrew, 7641. Okay. Yeah, so if we scroll down, here's the outline of biblical usage: flowing stream or ear of grain. I'm guessing it was stream because they were at the Jordan River guarding the crossing. Accents give you away. Yes, that's right. And it gave Jesus away too, didn't it? Jesus had twang. He didn't speak, the professional Hebrew of the, let's say, the Temple Complex or the Sanhedrin. He had a Galilean accent, right? That's like Texan. On page 64, it talks about how his accent gave him away as a Galilean in Matthew 26:73. And on the day of Pentecost, the people heard, right, the apostles speaking. but they all heard it in their own language, and they're like, wait a minute, aren't these Galileans? How would they know this? You know, the accent gives you away for sure. Page 65 continues. Oh, it's the "You're not from around here" section. And they really help us to think about geography in this section because of, you know, we tend to think of Jerusalem as this beautiful, giant, glorious city because we read so much about it in the Old and New Testaments. We read about Solomon's temple and later King Herod's temple. And, you know, we're so focused on just the Jerusalem piece, we don't often stop and think about the context of it in the wider Roman world. The map on the screen shows the wider Roman world, and I should have put a little star on here for Judea. You can't see my arrow, but if I point, so you've got the Atlantic over here and the Mediterranean. There is the Sea of Galilee, this tiny little blue speck. That's the Dead Sea under the U of Judea. The Romans called this Syria Palestina, which eventually is how we get the name Palestine. But it is a tiny backwater of a place compared to Rome, right? And Pliny the Elder has a comment about that on page 65. The authors bring up his statement that Jerusalem of Jesus' day was the most illustrious city in the East. And they say that's faint praise. Yeah, a bit. Yeah. Yeah. Pliny the Elder actually, he died in Pompeii when Vesuvius erupted. So did Drusilla. Sorry, side note. But anyway, you know Drusilla from the book of Acts? She did too. Okay. We must note well, it says in the middle of page 65, the qualification. It was the greatest city on the eastern fringe of the empire. The statement might compare to a New Yorker saying the nicest town in the backwaters of Louisiana. Louisiana. The importance of Palestine was, Roman Palestine, was entirely geographic, right? The taxes didn't help the Roman budget. They weren't known for anything except trouble, right? Pilate actually loses his job shortly after the crucifixion of Jesus because he's too violent, trying to quell the rebellions. The reason the Romans wanted Judea was because it was linked to the breadbasket of Egypt and Africa. It was on the trade route. They wanted to control the trade routes. It says at the bottom of 65, if we fail to recognize this, we can fail to recognize just how remarkable the rapid growth of the early church really was. That it came from such a small place that was so insignificant in the wider Roman Empire. And yet, it took over like wildfire. We see new churches pop up everywhere in the Roman Empire. That's right. Every one of those nations that were given up after the Tower of Babel were all brought back together. And then when the people went back home, they took the gospel with them. Absolutely. And that actually brings us to the next point on page 66 in the section, I'm with him. And it talks about, that is in 1 Corinthians. One of you says, well, Paul's upset because one of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas. Still another, I follow Christ. So what likely goes without being said for us is that the church was divided either theologically or over devotion to different personalities. But here's the thing. Each of those personalities are from a different geographic area. So you've got Apollos, who's from Alexandria. We read about that in Acts 18. So Alexandria was the second largest population of Jewish people outside of Judea during the time of Jesus. They had a huge population. Remember, Alexandria is known for its ancient library and the big lighthouse. And it is. Yeah, Alexandria is in Egypt. I had a grad student from Alexandria, which was cool. I peppered him with questions. Yeah, so Apollos is from Alexandria. Cephas is really Peter, and we know he was from Galilee, right? By the Sea of Galilee. And so that's that star on the map. And he would have spoken Aramaic, right? Cephas is his Aramaic name. And then let's see, we've got Paul over in Corinth, since he's writing to the Corinthians in this section. The Corinthians were quite proud of their status as residents of a Roman colony, and they enjoyed using Latin. So these are Latin speakers. So the problem was ethnic division. Aramaic-speaking Jews, Greek-speaking Jews, Romans, and Alexandrians. So that helps us to understand Paul's frustration. He's like, no, we're not going to split among these lines, right? We're all one. Like we do in the church today. We only have 600 denominations. Okay, so on to the conclusion. We'll talk about Ruth. This is so fitting. We're talking about Ruth on Sunday mornings. Okay, we're on what page is this? 67, thank you. So the authors conclude with some steps that we can take to help us uncover what goes without being said about race and ethnicity. So the first step is making a thorough and honest inventory of your assumptions about people who are different from you. Take time to prayerfully consider your prejudices. Consider asking your close friends or family whether they hear you making statements or tell jokes about certain people or groups. They also say read the Bible with an atlas handy. Being able to see the location really makes a difference, doesn't it? Like with Alexandria today, right? Let's see, Bible authors don't often tell us how they or their audience is felt about specific people groups, but they do give us clues where they're from. Okay, so like for us, commenting that someone is from rural Arkansas or the south side of Chicago, we know what that means, right? But sometimes we don't know what the biblical authors mean. So if we look up the map and think of the history of that people group, then we'll get a clue. And Ruth is totally that way, with how many times they call her Ruth the Moabite. That is repeated over and over. They want us to know she is a Moabite. She is not an Israelite, right? Why does that matter? So they talk about it on page 67. The authors say, finally, let the Bible be your guide, right? The book of Ruth provides this example about how she's repeatedly identified as Ruth the Moabite, and how, she's almost redeemed by some other guy in the family, but he's like, oh, it's Ruth the Moabite. I can't do it. So thankfully Boaz does. And on page 68, they explain the problem with being a Moabite. Moabites were created from the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. So that created the Moabites and the Ammonites. We read that in Genesis 19. So that's one part of it. Also, the Moabite people were not very nice to the Israelites, right? Remember what they did with Balaam? And they hired him to curse Israel, which actually backfired. That was in Numbers 22. But just a couple chapters later, in Numbers 25, Moabite women come over to the Israelite camp to try to entice them. And we actually read about a woman named Cosby who took the fall for all of that in Numbers 25. So yeah, they're pretty cursed. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even to the 10th generation. Deuteronomy 23:3. So it's pretty remarkable. She's in the lineage of Christ. So that shows you her faith. She gave up the gods of Moab and followed the one true God, the Israelite God. So she changed her allegiance as well as took care of her mother-in-law Naomi. And because of her allegiance and her care for Naomi, the people accepted her. Maybe not at first. It might have taken a minute, right? Because of the baggage that the name Moabite carried, right? But I think she won them over pretty quickly by her demeanor and her actions. The authors on page 68 in the middle say that, we've been pointing out prejudices of the Bible characters, but please bear in mind, we are not endorsing prejudice. I think we all know that. The Christian message is clear. Ethnic prejudice is morally reprehensible. It's wrong. But the Roman world was filled with racism, and that shows up in the biblical text. So I think it helps us if we understand that, we're aware of it. And the last sentence says we would add that failing to come to terms with our assumptions about race and ethnicity will keep us blind to important aspects of biblical teaching. So I think awareness is key, right? Just paying attention to those little details that the authors put in there, whether it's geographic, whether it's language, whether it's ethnicity, and that will help us to read the Bible more faithfully to what the authors intended, even if there are ethnic slurs. Now we know. Okay. All right, reflection question time. I really like question 3 on page 69. I think that can help us today. How does knowing the Philippians prize their elite Roman identity change how you hear Paul's claim that our true citizenship is in heaven? So take a minute and think about question number 3 and then chat with your neighbor about it. Okay, you guys did fantastic today. I love hearing all of your thoughts. Next week we'll be in chapter 3. It's called Just Words, and it's all about language. So similes, metaphors, idioms. We're going to talk about all of that. Okay, thank you guys